And for those I did not have an opportunity to meet yesterday, I want to extend my hearty welcome to all of you, and thanks for your participation in what is truly on our academic calendar, certainly one of the highlights. Now, in a two-day conference of this nature, it can be a real challenge if the first day is particularly fascinating and wide-ranging, interesting topics. It's tough to kind of come up to that same standard, but I think you'll all agree with me as we look across what's been scheduled for today. I think we're going to meet that standard, particularly with the first presentation that we have today. Many of us, when Professor Barrett and Professor Luban and the fellows started to put the schedule together for the McCain conference for this year, we were particularly drawn to this topic and the subject matter expert that's presenting on this. For those familiar with the Naval Academy and its efforts over the past few years with experiential leader development, you'll know that one of the centerpieces of how we approach experiential development is through staff rides, primarily to Gettysburg as we go. So the development of our brigade leadership, the Stripers, as well as varsity team captains and many other audiences, to include staff rides that commemorated the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, the 150th anniversary of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and so on. We've really used the 16th president as a point of focus for lessons in ethical leadership, lessons of character, strategic leadership, and the like. But in all of that conversation over the course of the past several years, particularly, we have not approached it from this particular angle. So we're really fascinated in seeing where this goes, and it fits so nicely, certainly with the nature of the conversations yesterday. So with that said, it's my honor to introduce to you Professor Christopher Kit Wellman. He's a professor of philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Wellman works in ethics, specializing in political and legal philosophy. The two topics on which he has written most extensively are our rights to political self-determination, to include secession, topic for today, and our political obligations, especially the duty to obey law. He's currently working on a variety of practical and theoretical issues related to international law. Professor Wellman has published in a variety of journals, including the American Philosophical Quarterly, Ethics, Law, and Philosophy, Legal Theory, and many others. And his books include A Theory of Secession, The Case for Political Self-Determination, and Is There a Duty to Obey the Law, for Blackwell Publishers. He's edited several volumes to include a companion to Applied Ethics and Contemporary Debates in Applied Ethics. So perfect background, a perfect topic to kick off day two of the McCain conference. And again, welcome, Professor Wellman.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and more importantly, thank you for having me. Very fortunate. This is the second time I've been able to come to this conference, which is an absolutely spectacular affair, and it's just a treat to be able to talk about these issues, and especially to be among the other presenters yesterday and today who just doing fantastic work. So my normal style is I'll pick a thesis, and no matter how implausible, I'll stick to it and try and ram it down the audience's throat. Today, I'm going to do something a little more tentative, and it's not because I don't have a dog in the fight. It's because I've got two dogs in the fight. I have for some time thought and given arguments for why Lincoln's war to preserve the Union was just. But more recently, I'm beginning to rethink that and wonder if that's not in fact false. And so I'll give both sides. And so if you end up agreeing with either side, you're just agreeing with different incarnations with me, so I'm not going to feel threatened. So what I'd like to do is three things. First, I'd like to read some quotes from Lincoln, which I take to be arguments that he gave to explain why the South did not have a right to secede. And I'll explain why all 10 of those I think are wanting. So the way I see it, I'm not convinced I've got an exhaustive list, but the way I see it, Lincoln gave at least 10 arguments against the South's right to secede. 2 of them were against secession of any stripe. 1 is against secession from a democracy, and then 7 were directed in particular against the Confederacy. And then what I'll do is also invoke another quote of his to suggest an argument that he didn't give, but what I think he might give, which would give a much stronger argument for preserving the Union. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts about why I am no longer as convinced that that's necessarily the case, that those arguments are necessarily compelling. And a few caveats here. So I'm not a historian, and even if I were, I'd be very reluctant to necessarily say that this is what Lincoln believed. I'm not in a position to say whether he wrote this or claimed this for a matter of political strategy, or he actually thought it was the truth, or things like that. But I'm going to just take some quotes and try and explain why I think they could, even if whatever Lincoln believed, they could have been used to ground arguments, explain those arguments, and then we can talk about them. All right. So first off, Lincoln said, if a minority will secede rather than submit, they make a precedent which in turn will divide and ruin them. For a minority of their own number will secede from them whenever a majority refuses to be controlled by such majority. Second quote along the same lines, for instance, why may not South Carolina a year or 2 hence arbitrarily secede from the new Southern Confederacy, just as she now claims to secede from the present Union? Her people, and indeed all secession people, are now being educated to the precise temper of doing this. Is there such a perfect identity of interests among the states to compose a Southern Union as to produce harmony only and prevent renewed secession? Will South Carolina be found lacking in either restlessness or ingenuity to pick a quarrel with Kentucky? So this argument, I think, is at least gesturing to what is sometimes called the Russian doll argument. And the idea is that if you allow secession once, then there's no, it can take either a logical form or a practical form. There's no reason why there wouldn't be additional iterations of that, right? And then this is going to end up in something which is obviously absurd and, as a practical matter, unpalatable. So I should say the fact that there are going to be future iterations in and of itself is not a problem, right? So if you say, look, if you start putting your pants on one leg at a time, then everyone's going to put her pants on one leg at a time, you know. So yeah, I don't see the problem. So it's got to be something about the multiple iterations which is problematic in a way that taking the pants off, putting pants on one leg at a time is not. And presumably, the idea here is that if you allow secession, then there's no stopping it until you get to circumstances in which you don't have political stability, all right? Where what are you going to do the next time when a subunit wants to secede and then a further subunit, and then you're not going to have a situation which is politically viable and human rights are going to be insecure. So I agree that if there are enough secessions and enough small units being formed, that we could be in a very politically dangerous environment. But it's not clear that the slope is as slippery as some people would suggest. And it's not clear that we can't separate harmful from harmless state breaking, right? So if you think, for instance, we don't like people driving drunk, we don't say, okay, there can be no driving. We say there can be no driving while you're intoxicated. Similarly, we can make discriminations, and we can say, if the secession is going to, if this particular secession is not going to lead to political disaster or bad political consequences, then it can be permissible. If not, then not. So I'm just, it's a type of slippery slope argument. I'm just not convinced that either, certainly not conceptually and perhaps not practically, that the slope is slippery as some might fear. So the second argument, which is also an argument against all secession, Lincoln says, if all states, save one, should assert the power to drive the one out of the Union, it is presumed the whole class of seceder politicians would at once deny the power and denounced the act as the greatest outrage upon the states. But suppose that precisely the same act, instead of being called driving the one out, should be called seceding from the others, the seceding of the others from the one. It would be exactly what the seceders claim to do, unless indeed they make the point that the one, because it is the minority, may rightfully do what the others, because of their majority, may not rightfully do. So here, Lincoln, I think, is saying, look, it doesn't matter whether 49, there's no moral magic in the number 50, right? So it doesn't matter if 49% of the Union wants to secede from 51% of the Union, or 51% of the Union wants to secede from 49% of the Union. But if a majority were to exclude a minority, and certainly if everyone say we're going to secede from, Rhode Island, the other 49 states were to secede from Rhode Island, people would be up in arms, you can't do that. But that's precisely what the South is doing, because there's no morally important difference between majority secession, which is sometimes called exclusion, and minority secession. And here I'm inclined to agree with Lincoln on the point that whether or not the seceding group is a majority or a minority is not material. What does matter, it seems to me, is whether both the seceding state and the rump state are large, contiguous, and structured in such a way that they can be politically viable, right? And what would be problematic is if the vast majority left a very small group that was not politically viable, and then leaving them in a circumstance where the individuals left behind couldn't have institutions which perform the requisite political functions. So that seems to me to be the important line, and Lincoln's right, it's not the majority-minority line. But once you recognize that's the line, that's not an argument against all secession. It's not even an argument against the South seceding, because we don't worry that the North would have been politically inviable without the Confederacy. So those are the two arguments that I think are just against secession in general. The third is just that Lincoln thought that secession was incompatible and unnecessary in a Republican form of government, which I'll just cash out as saying, look, in a democracy, secession is a no-go. And it's incompatible with democracy, right? Because the whole idea of democracy is you've got to go along with the vote. You can't say, well, we'll vote, and if we get our way, fine. If we don't get our way, we're not going to go along, right? So we'll vote on this law, and as long as the law is what we like, we'll obey it, and we'll disobey it if we're not in the majority. And Lincoln said about himself, what the Confederacy is saying is, well, we'll vote, but if Lincoln's elected, we're out. He's like, that's incompatible with democracy. That's not how democracy works. And the other thing is he thinks that, look, whatever you're going to say about, some imperiled group trying to have its own state because it's in a tyranny, we don't worry about that in democracy, because democracy has the institutional mechanisms for change, and those are the institutional mechanisms that you should invoke, not secession. So a lot can be said here. I'll just say two things very quickly. One is that it seems to me there's a big difference between saying, well, we're going to remain in the Union and obey only those laws that we voted in favor of, right? And saying, we're going to leave the Union, right? Because when you leave the Union, you're not continuing to vote in elections and then disobey the results. The other thing is that it's not necessarily the case that democracy is going to make sure that individuals or groups are always taken care of. And we've got, of course, the problem of persistent minorities. And some people think that secession is an appropriate mechanism, even within democracies, for persistent minorities to take care of themselves. Okay, so those are the more general ones. Now we get into the 7 arguments against the South in particular. The first is that Lincoln says, our adversaries have adopted some declaration of independence, which, unlike the good old one penned by Jefferson, they omit the words, all men are created equal. Why? They have adopted a temporary national constitution, in the preamble of which, unlike the good old one signed by Washington, they omit "we the people" and substitute "we the deputies of the sovereign and independent states." Why? Why this deliberate and pressing out of view the rights of men and the authority of the people? Second quote along these lines. The Constitution provides, and all the states have accepted the provision that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. But if a state will lawfully go out of the union, having done so, it may also discard the republican form of government, so that to prevent its going out is an indispensable means to the end of maintaining the guaranteed mentioned. Okay, a lot of words there. What I think Lincoln's suggesting is that what we have is a democracy. And there's no, if you look at the documents that the Confederacy has created, there's no indication that they're going to secure this democracy. And so they're going to be forming a much less just government. So the only way we can ensure that this new union isn't, this new undemocratic union isn't formed is to force the South to stay in the democracy. And I actually do believe that a seceding group doesn't have the right to secede to form a substantially less just state. So I think that if there were credible evidence of this, then I think it would be a legitimate worry. I'm not convinced that just looking at the Constitution that the Confederacy drew up is reliable evidence, though. And I think a more plausible interpretation is that the reason the Confederacy were emphasizing that they were the representatives of sovereign states is because they wanted, bless you, they wanted to emphasize that they had the standing to withdraw. And so we can't infer that it would necessarily be undemocratic or demonstrably less democratic. Okay, second argument against the Confederacy in general. It may well be questioned whether today a majority of the legally qualified voters in the state, except perhaps South Carolina, is in favor of disunion. There is much reason to believe that the Union men are in the majority in many, if not in every other one, of the so-called seceded states. All right, so here what Lincoln is suggesting is that the people don't want to secede, right? That there are some elites who have co-opted this and are forcing this down, and so if the people don't want to leave, there's no right for secession. Again, I agree that if there are some elites who knew that the majority didn't want to secede, then the secession wouldn't be permissible. I'm not as convinced as Lincoln that this was the case. And I also think it may be anachronistic to require a plebiscite at this time. There wasn't a plebiscite, for instance, with what we call the American Revolution, which was in fact a secession. And I bet Lincoln wouldn't want to say that therefore the American Revolution was impermissible. And in fact, given how hard and how long the Confederacy fought for its sovereignty, it seems plausible to suggest that Lincoln may have underestimated the sentiments of the Southerners. Okay. The next argument Lincoln says, if the United States be not a government proper, but an association of states in the nature of a contract merely, can it, as a contract, be peacefully unmade by less than all the partners who made it? Second quote, one party to the contract may violate it, break it, so to speak, but does it not require all to rescind it? So here I don't think Lincoln thought that the Union was a mere contract. But he says, look, for the sake of argument, let's just say it is a contract. If it is a contract, as they're alleging, then they're contractually bound, right? You can't say, I'll deliver you widgets on Tuesday and then not deliver the widgets, right? So if they're contractually obligated, then this union can't be broken up. Quickly, I think there are two problems with this, right? One is that even if it is a contract, right? I don't think that ancestors can bind their descendants in perpetuity, right? So my parents would have been much happier if I'd done something other than be a philosophy professor, but it's my call, right? And so they, I don't know what they would have wanted me to do, maybe be a military leader, right? They can't commit me to that. And similarly, it's not possible, it doesn't seem possible for a previous generation to contractually obligate a subsequent generation. Second of all, to the extent that if you think that the political context is distinct and that political debts can be intergenerational, and I have some sympathy for that, that I think at most would imply is that there would have to be certain terms to the breakup, right? So that there would have to be certain terms to the political divorce, and that the descendants of the people who entered into the contract would have to break the contract in a fair fashion, right? And notice, for instance, that even in the case of marriage, where it's not intergenerational, it is explicit, it's clearly consensual, right? We don't say that someone has to stay in the marriage no matter what. We just say, okay, there have to be certain terms and conditions on the way a marriage is dissolved. All right. So the next argument is that Lincoln thought that the Southern position rested on an ingenious sophism, and that was that the quote, "Any state of the Union may consistently with the national Constitution and therefore lawfully and peacefully withdraw from the Union without the consent of the Union or any other state." And he goes on, I'll give you two more quick quotes. Second, there is some omnipotent and sacred supremacy pertaining to the state. And he says, our states have neither more nor less power than that reserved to them in the Union by the Constitution, no one of them ever having been a state out of the Union. So again, this is the second indication that there was a lot of discussion about what type of entity the states were, and people thought that this was very important to establishing whether or not there would be a right to secede. And Lincoln said, look, they weren't states before the Union, so they can't claim that to the extent that they have any status, it's the status that was created within the Union, and so they can't allege that they're these sovereign units who now get to withdraw. And here I'm inclined to say, even if that's true, even if there's whatever standing they have, it was made possible and facilitated only because of the Union, it doesn't follow that they may not secede and form their own states later. Just not the case that we insist that in order to become a state, you had to have been a state before the Union. Maybe the Kurds should be allowed to secede from Iraq, maybe they shouldn't, but it seems wrong to say whether they shouldn't because they weren't an independent state or they weren't an independent state in this particular configuration beforehand. So I understand why, given the discussions of the day, that as a political matter, Lincoln would emphasize this, but I don't think it is a strong argument. Okay, so we're getting close to the end. We've got three more here. So Lincoln, one of the things is that Lincoln wondered about the economic harm that might come to the, quote, plain people, and he claimed that, quote, they understand without argument that destroying the government, which was made by Washington, means no good to them. And so here I take it he's saying, look, the people of the South understand that they're going to be much less well off economically if there's a secession. And that may have been true, or it certainly may have been true in the short term, right? But my view is this isn't an argument against their right to secede, because it's their right to decide what kind of premium to put on economic flourishing, right? So I could probably make a lot more money doing something other than being a school teacher, right? But if I choose to teach philosophy, right, and have those economic opportunity costs, that's my call. And we want to say the same thing about political units, and I think prospective political units, right? It's not our business to tell Canada that it has to restructure or it has a duty to restructure in a certain way because it'll make more money or be more economically successful. So I think that just as Canada has a right to chart its own economic course and take its economic lumps that the South did as well. All right, longer quote here, so bear with me this next argument. Nothing should ever be implied as law which leads to an unjust or absurd consequences. The nation purchased with money the countries out of which several of these states were formed. Is it just that they shall go off without leave and without refunding? The nation paid very large sums to relieve Florida of the aboriginal tribes. Is it just that that she shall now be off without consent, without making any return? The nation is now in debt for money applied to the benefit of these so-called seceding states in common with the rest. Is it just either that creditors shall go unpaid or the remaining state pay the whole? A part of the present national debt was contracted to pay the old debts of Texas. Is it just that she shall leave and pay no part of this herself? Again, if one state may secede, so may another. And when all shall have seceded, none is left to pay the debts. Is this quite just to creditors? Did we notify them of this sage view of ours when we borrowed the money? All right. So the idea is, whoa, you know, we've got a big national debt, and they're just going to skip off, so they don't have a right to take off because they've incurred their share of the debt, and they need to stay in the union and pay it. So here I'm inclined to disaggregate rights of political self-determination and duties of distributive justice, right? And it may very well be that, that you may not secede without paying your portion of the debt, bless you, but that's very different than saying you may not secede. We do this, for instance, in marital divorce. When a couple separates, we don't say, okay, one person leaves and the other person's stuck with all the debt. We divide the assets and the debts. So there's no reason that the same solution couldn't be done with political divorce. And then finally, Lincoln said the Union goal, he argued, is that to ensure that, quote, the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from earth. Okay. Now, again, I'm not a historian, and so this is speculative on my part, but what I think really motivated Lincoln more than anything was that, like any of us, he didn't want to be at the helm when his country disintegrated, right? I get that. But he also believed that this just wasn't just any country, right? I think he genuinely believed that this was a great democratic experiment, and that it wasn't just important. It wasn't important just that for the people in the United States that the Union stay together, bless you, but that the United States was a prospective model to the rest of the world, and one with enormous potential, right? So that there was a debt to humanity, or there was a responsibility to humanity going forward, that we keep this union together so that we make this democracy work, because this was something really special, and if we could show the rest of the world how a democracy might function, right, then humanity going forward would be that much better off. And I think this isn't, I think that, you know, some of these things might have been political, some of these things might have been responses to, you know, what had political currency of the day, but I think my guess is that this was really genuine and really important. And I have a lot of sympathy for it, but I'll just, mindful of the time, say a couple things here. The first is that even if you think that it's important to be a model, it's not obvious to me that the North, an independent North, wouldn't have been a better model, right? It's not clear that the North without the Confederacy would have been enjoyed more economic, political, and moral success on its own. So it's not clear that the great democratic experiment would have failed. It might have flourished that much better with just the North. The second thing is that even if you want to conduct this experiment, it's not clear that you get to deny other people's rights to political self-determination to do so, right? So you think, well, this could be a really important example to future generations. So imagine that the United States thought, well, we can pull something off something really special, right? If we merge with Canada. And then we said, Canada, why don't you merge with us and we can have this type of political organization which will be a model for the future. And if Canada says, no, thank you, right? You're not allowed to forcibly annex Canada, right, against their will in order to perform this experiment, right? And so if that seems right, and it does to me, that we're not allowed to deny Canada's political self-determination in order to engage in a political experiment, no matter how excited we are about the experiment, right? Maybe we should say the same thing about the South's political self-determination, right? That even if it is the case that we're less confident that, bless you, the democracy will function well in their absence, that doesn't mean we necessarily get to force them against their wishes to remain in the Union. And the third thing, and this is very controversial, is that not a lot of people, because there aren't that many people who study secession, but some people believe that the best arguments for secession are democratic, right? Just very briefly, the idea is, even if you think we have to have states, and almost everybody does, it doesn't mean that we have to have states that are drawn according to their current territorial districted lines, right? And we might be able to move them, and some people think that you should apply democracy to that question. You should let the people decide where the state line should be. So it might actually be that democracy requires permitting secession, and that's the best argument for political self-determination. So very briefly, those are the arguments in Lincoln that I've been able to find, and that is why I'm not convinced by any of them. But I've never been a boo Lincoln guy. And I think that there's a stronger argument to be made. And I'm going to read a quote which I think doesn't make it, but helps point the way towards a much stronger argument for preserving the Union. So Lincoln wrote, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. Now here, I need to tread very carefully because I don't know that this was actually Lincoln's position, right? This could have been trying to pacify the South and say, look, I'm not, interested in disrupting slavery. But what I think is very interesting here is, and very insightful, is that Lincoln appreciated that there are two different questions. There's the slavery question and there's the Union question. I would put it a little differently, though. I'd say there's the slavery question and there's the political self-determination question. All right? And what Lincoln said after he disaggregated these two questions, he says, the Union question is paramount. That's my focus. And I'll do whatever I have to do on the slavery issue in order to preserve the Union. I think that he got, after he very insightfully separated these two issues, he got things backwards. I would say the slavery issue is paramount. This is a human rights atrocity, right? And that it might be that what position he takes on the political self-determination of the South is contingent upon what he needs to do to eradicate slavery. All right? So what I would invite Lincoln to do is to turn to the South and say, two separate issues, self-determination and slavery. You have the right to secede if you're able and willing to perform the requisite political functions, which is to say, if you're going to protect the basic human rights of your citizens. But you're not protecting the basic human rights of your citizens with slavery, right? So that disqualifies your right to secede. If you're willing to end slavery, then I have no claim to keep you in the Union. You may secede. But if you're unwilling to end slavery, then, and the only way that I can force you to end slavery is to force you to stay in the Union, and for the Union as a whole to end slavery, that's what I'm going to do. Okay? And so for me, I would say, for instance, I've used the analogy of Canada. So I would say this would be the case even if they were separate countries, even if there were two countries, say there was a North and a South, and the South had slavery. I think the North would have been in a position to say to an independent South, you need to end slavery. And if you don't, we're going to conduct a humanitarian intervention. And in order to ensure that you don't revert back to slavery, we're going to force you into a larger union. Right? So I'm one of the most unapologetic defenders of political self-determination in the literature, right? But I don't fetishize it above all else. And you can't hide behind political self-determination to do mass human rights atrocities against your constituents. So I think that is an approach. And now this is speculative. If we speculate, as I'm inclined to do, that the South would not have said, deal, we're going to end slavery and we're going to go our separate way. I know that there are a lot of people who understand the War of Northern Aggression to be about states' rights, and so I may be wrong, right? But I speculate that the South wouldn't have done that. But if Lincoln had said, you may go your merry way as long as you go justly, and that involves eradicating slavery, and they refuse to do so, then I think that's a paradigmatic just cause, right? If the eradication of slavery doesn't constitute a just cause, it's hard to see what would be. And so it has always looked to me as though even if Lincoln didn't articulate it the way I would recommend that he do so, that there was a just cause for fighting the Civil War. But I'm now starting to doubt that. And in a word, the reason why I'm starting to doubt that is proportionality. Right? It's not enough for war to be just for there to be a just cause. The war effort has to be proportionate. And when you stop to think at how horrifically destructive and long and costly in terms of treasure and blood that the Civil War was, I think it at least raises the question about whether, even if you agree with me that this is a just cause, whether the Civil War was just. Now, I recognize that people thought, look, we're going to go down, we're going to eliminate slavery, we're going to, suppress the rebels, and we'll be back by tea time, right? So that there's vast, as often as is the case, there's a vast underestimation of the enemies. So I'm not blaming Lincoln or the Northern troops for their assessments, but nonetheless, as an objective matter, their assessment might have been wrong, it might have been disproportionate, and it might have been unjust. Now here, I'm torn, because you think, really, Kit, you're going to put a price tag on eliminating slavery, right? And if so, where do you put the price tag, right? I mean, elimination of slavery is worth, as someone said yesterday, breaking a lot of eggs, right? So I'm not exactly sure that the first proportionality concern is necessarily right. But here's the second thing. When I look at our country now, and I look at our history, I'm so discouraged at how slow the progress has been with racial injustice, and how long it's taken for us to come as far as we've come, right? And I think it's worth asking if our history of racial injustice, our experience with Jim Crow and the like, would have been much less bad had we pursued alternate avenues to eliminate slavery than an all-out military defeat, right? And this, I'm almost embarrassed to use this, but this is the case that actually triggered my thinking about this because it's so banal, but it's the integration of women into Augusta National, the golf club, right? So there was enormous pressure being brought to bear on Augusta National that there were no women. And I think it was Hootie Johnson was in charge of the club at that point. And he said, we will not include women at the end of a bayonet, right? And so there was, right? And then people went their way. And then a little time later, right, the Augusta National decided, announced that they started including women members. Again, I'm not a member of Augusta National, right? I don't have the empirical thing, but I would speculate that the integration of women into Augusta National is going to go so much better because it wasn't forced, right? Pressure was brought to bear. I'm sure that discussions were provoked. I'm not surprised that, I wouldn't be surprised if it came much earlier because of these pressures and things like that. But there wasn't some legal mandate because of some Supreme Court case, right, telling the members of Augusta National that they had to have women involved. So, and this is, again, I'm not, uncharacteristically, I'm not trying to ram a thesis down your throat. I'm just trying to ask questions. I'm now wondering, given how much blood and money, right, we spent on the Civil War, it seems plausible at least to ask, what if we just spent a fraction of that, instead of investing in a stick, investing in carrots to try and help the transition away from slavery, right? It was, so, I mean, I get the temptation. If someone's got a slave, right, I want to pick up a gun and I want to tell her, you need to free that slave now. I get the temptation, right? But when you look at what actually works in the real world, we weren't the only country, right, with slavery. There were plenty of countries that had slavery and ended slavery without civil wars. And what distinguishes us, I would say, is the fact that we had a war and, regrettably, the fact that the legacy of slavery continues in the United States as badly as it does. So if you put those two questions together, even if it's not, even if it wasn't disproportionate to fight the war, if, in order to end slavery, if things had gone really well, given how badly they went, I think it might be the case that Lincoln's war to preserve the Union was unjust, not because there was no just cause, but because it was disproportionate. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions. As we did yesterday, if you don't mind, if you'd step to one of the microphones, we'll go back and you could select who you'd like to ask your questions.
Okay. Right here.
Okay. Do you want to go to the
If you would, please. Thanks.
Marcus Hedal, I'm from here at the Naval Academy. I do want to say one thing about the Augusta National comment, just because you ended with it. I would recommend against using that just because it's impossible to know whether or not we've made more progress because it wasn't forced, right? So they literally don't have any open records on how many women are members or how many days they don't have women playing golf or any of that stuff. But in more fairness in academic, so I was wondering about if you could talk a little bit about exit conditions. So you mentioned that twice. Once in the notion of the contract and once in the notion of the debt. And so we do force people at times to do things when they can't exit morally appropriately, right? So in cases of aid and in cases of where they induce reliance, right? And so when people exit things like a marriage, they often have the Hofeldian kind of powers to decide what is fair, right? We leave it up to them, right? But of course, if we can't settle our political differences in a political community anyway, then it doesn't make sense to think that we'd be able to do that, right? But I worry that the analogy might break down because we allow people to do that because there's background conditions in which to determine what's just when people can't do it themselves, right? And that's hard enough when we're just dealing with money, but as you mentioned in your last argument, once you start dealing with other people, right, then our responsibilities to other people becomes way more complicated, right? And so if there isn't an international structure in which to allow these kinds of morally acceptable exits, right, and we do generally hold people still to remain at times if they can't exit morally, does that have any impact on the arguments about the ability to leave? If there's no way to kind of figure out what's morally in terms of the exit, can we then say, well, then you have to stay at home?
A great question. I think it does have implications. I'm not convinced the implication is that therefore there's no right to secede. So here's the idea. So you and I get divorced. We've been investing in your career. I've been staying home with the kids, right? And then if we just go our separate ways, the most valuable asset that we've developed is your career, right? And it would be a gross injustice if you didn't, after separation, continue transfers. And so do we therefore say you may not divorce me? No, but we say if you're going to divorce me, you must continue to transfer. And we're cool in the gang with that because we're part of a larger structure where we've got police that can come get you as a deadbeat dad, right? And say, we're going to send you to jail unless you give this. So I have the confidence that I'm going to continue to get the transfers even after divorce. And the question is, we don't have that confidence in the international realm because there's no international state that's going to come and say to the South, right, you haven't been paying your palimony, right? You haven't been paying your share of the Louisiana Purchase, okay? And so given that disanalogy, we shouldn't be so quick, as Kit's tempted to do, to say, look, there's duties of distributed justice and there's rights of freedom of association and they're separable. Okay. A couple things. One, as a general matter, we do incur debts, right? So there's the debt that, that one country gave to another that says, okay, we'll buy the Louisiana Purchase and we can't give you all the money today, but we'll gladly, pay you on Tuesday for a hamburger today, right? We do that. We do have these debts in the absence of a state, so it's in the absence of an international legal regime that we're completely commensurate with force. So it's not the case that we have no confidence between states. Second of all, if there was some specific reason to doubt that the secessionist group is going to renege, then the potential rump state can ask for collateral or credibility or things like this. Yeah, go ahead.
Follow up?
Absolutely.
So the question is not whether they'll pay. The question is it's indeterminate what their fair share is, right? And the way that we figure that out is through either political agreement or some court, right? So it's not that they won't pay. It's that together we're supposed to figure out what that is, and we can't do that anyway because we can't politically agree.
Right. Okay. So this, I think it's a thornier issue, but I don't think it's an insuperable issue, right? So what inevitably happens when you and I divorce, right, is that you grouse about how the judge is making you pay more than you should, and I grouse about how the judge is making you pay less than you should, right? But at least there's a judge who could definitively settle it. So that's going to be a more difficult issue, but you could say we need to, there's two things. Even if there's vague, there are objective answers, even if the boundaries are vague, right? And if you're willing to pay what you in fact owe, then you have a right to secede, right? It's a psychological matter about what you do about a person who has an unrealistic expectation about what you owe. Alan.
Just a couple of quick points. First of all, it was a dead letter as to whether Lincoln could allow the South to secede if they gave up slavery, because the Confederates made it very clear they wouldn't give up slavery in any circumstances. This came out at a late date in the peace dealer meeting at City Point with Alexander Stevens. Okay, so that was, it wouldn't have made any sense for Lincoln to even make that proposal. So I think that's, you can't really fault for that. As to whether there could have been a peaceful solution to ending slavery as it was in the British Empire, the answer is no. The South seceded preemptively to avoid a peaceful abolition of slavery. They knew the demographics were going against them. The representation of Congress based on population, the North was getting almost all of the immigrants from Europe. The population was going up. More representation of Congress. they knew that most of the new states going into the Union in the West were not going to be slave states. They seceded preemptively to avoid a peaceful constitutional abolition of slavery. Very explicit statements of the Confederate leaders. So I don't think, as opposed to the case of the Dutch East Indies and the French colonial holdings and the British slavery, I don't think it was feasible at all to think that there could have been a peaceful resolution of slavery in the United States. And so I don't think that should have figured into any proportionality.
Okay, so you know much more about the history than I, and so let's concede for the sake of argument that if the question was asked of the Confederates, that they would have said, no, we're not going to abolish slavery. And let's also concede that in the short term, carrots, no matter how sweet, would not have sufficed, right? That the only way to end it would have been with a stick, a bloody war. If we concede both of those things, then it's still, I think, an open question about how long slavery would have persisted in the South if it became, after a matter of time, the choice was carrots or stick, right? So we can either do this the easy way or the hard way. And if you want to do it the easy way, these are the funds that we're willing to dedicate to help you transition out of slavery. But if you won't do that, then this is the war that we'll fight to force it. And it seems implausible to me to assume that slavery would still be going on now, right, if we had that approach. It does seem plausible that slavery would have lasted longer than it did. So then you've got the excruciating question about how long do you stand on the sidelines and not fight this war and allow this gross human rights atrocity to endure because you know that's going to be the best recipe for the long haul. If there's an algorithm for how you answer questions like that, I don't have it.
Chief, can I just add one quick quote into that? The Confederate ideology was expansionist. They had long agitated for annexing Cuba. They were the main Southerners, were the main instigators of the aggressive war against Mexico. They had plans for expanding slavery. They knew slavery couldn't persist unless it did expand territory. They had plans for expanding it throughout the western hemisphere. This would have been an enormously horrible thing in terms of human rights, but it also would have led eventually to a war, another war between the North and the South, because the North could not tolerate this kind of expansion of any power, much less a slave power, into the Western Hemisphere. So I think the case against, the case in favor of war is over determined. And in terms of proportionality, we're not just thinking about individuals being enslaved, we're thinking about people having their children sold for generation after generation. And so I think even in terms of strict proportionality, I'm in favor of saying, yeah, the war exists.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So I find your proportionality argument really interesting, but I think it's worth separating out exactly what the goal is, because there's the goal of ending whether slavery would have ended by itself, and there has been some historical work, including by Eric Foner, about the economics of slavery, and some indication that it would have phased out anyway, that it wasn't economically sustainable in the long run, given the way things are changing. But then then you raise a separate issue of whether race relations now would be better, right? And that's actually an entirely separate question from whether slavery would have ended on its own. So it's a different proportionality question in that. And this is where, I mean, I'm mostly an analytic philosopher, so it's not often that I invoke Frantz Fanon, but where Frantz Fanon's essay on Wretched of the Earth, about Algeria actually makes a point where he says, the colonizer speaks only one language, that of violence, right? And he has taught the colonized only one language, and that is the only language through which they can communicate. And so when it comes to settling race relations, it's possible that perhaps that is the only way in which the message could have been adequately communicated. So I'm not saying I advocate that or not, but that is something to consider.
Right. So I may be more of a fan of Fanon than you, but I'll just say this. I have two things. I'm not convinced that people speak only one language, and there are two depressing languages. One is, fear of violence, and the other is greed, right, and money. And I think there's enormous economic incentives involved, and that, the economic incentives motivated a worldview. And so I'm not convinced that economic utensils would necessarily be impotent. And I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, Taylor.
Good morning, sir. Ms. Shivan Anderson and I were wondering about your comments earlier due to the secession leaving two viable states, or the potential for further acts of secession to destabilize that politically. So my question is, the necessity to leave behind two politically viable states implies there is some ethical obligation on the seceding party to ensure they do not leave behind instability and unrest in the rump state, as you call it. But you also note that it is on the seceder to decide how it weighs its economic flourishing. Is economic flourishing, or just economic stability in general, not essential to that obligation to prevent further instability and unrest politically? And can it even be separated from political stability in the first place?
Okay, great question. So I should say that lurking in the back of my political theory is something I call Samaritan Ism, which is the idea that we do have positive duties to rescue folks when they're sufficiently imperiled, and you can do so at no unreasonable cost to yourself. And I think unless you acknowledge Samaritanism, you can't get political legitimacy, and that's not surprisingly going to have implications for secession. So as you point out, I'm going to say of the South seceding from the North, right? If the South were to leave the North in such peril in the state of nature that their human rights were insecure, right, then that would be impermissible. On the other hand, I say, look, if the South is going to leave and the North's not going to be doing quite as well off, right, does that mean they may not secede? No, I don't think so. And then you very astutely say, well, what about if there's going to be huge economic costs, right? What if the South secedes from the North and the Northerners in the rump state are so economically imperiled that there's subsistence rights? They're going to have trouble, with food, shelter, things like that. Then I think those types of concerns are paramount, and the South may not leave the North under those circumstances. And if that's true, then either the South is going to have to make transfers, economic transfers, or try and build the North's economic infrastructure before they secede, right? Or they may not secede. But I would say the same thing about independent neighbors, right? So if you had the North and the South were separate countries, and the Northerners' basic human rights, subsistence rights, were not being satisfied, I would think that the Southerners had a duty to rescue them. You want to follow up?
Yes, sir. Sir, I was thinking more outside of the context of the United States and the Civil War, where in the Middle East you have people wanting to secede. However, with the oil and extreme resource reliance for their economy, how
Right.
that would flush out.
Good. Yeah. So, so for me, there is the quick response is there's one question about secession, and then there's a completely second question about the oil revenue or the access to oil. And just because you can secede, and just because the oil reserves happen to be in the territory with which that you want to govern, doesn't mean that you necessarily have the property right, the exclusive property right, to that oil. And so you don't necessarily get to secede with all the revenue. And then that raises thorny theoretical and practical questions about how do you determine what is the just distribution, and then how do you ensure that that distribution takes place post-separation, right? And if there's a potential rump state that can only ensure that they're going to get what is owed to them or what they need by denying the secession, then they may deny the secession. Yes, sir. This would be the last question. I could go all day misunderstanding your questions, but
if I could return to that answer and bring it back to your proportionality argument regarding the Civil War, this is what makes me curious. As you talk about the justice and distributive justice concerns of economic well-being in both the seceding state and the rump state, and then you dismiss slavery as a significant human rights concern, where does the distributive justice owed to the slaves who are denied the fundamental aspects of humanity and human rights enter into that argument in terms of how long you're willing to tolerate this affront to their humanity and human rights in the name of proportionality?
So if I said anything to indicate that I might ask you to, I think I misunderstood, because if I said anything to dismiss the violation of the rights of the slaves, then I misspoke. I certainly didn't mean to do that.
And I may be attributing too much to it, but when you speak of proportionality and saying that, the greater evil that followed from the degree of impact that the legacy of slavery has had on the United States suggests that a nonviolent approach might have been more successful in easing that. Implicit in that is tolerating the existence of slavery for some considerable period of time to make that nonviolent mechanism effective. And as you do that, at the same time, you're denying a much more fundamental aspect of humanity than the economic concerns that justify your concerns about distributive justice and the question of secession otherwise.
Yes. Okay, that is true. I don't. So let's just say there's a military solution to end slavery and there's a diplomatic solution. Let's just simplify, right? And let's stipulate. This may not be true, but let's stipulate that the diplomatic solution is going to allow slavery to last 8 more years than if we had taken a military solution. And let's also stipulate that the diplomatic solution would have been followed by much less racial injustice, right? And then you say, you can say, right, that 8 additional years of slavery is so horrific, that's a decisive argument in favor of the military solution. Here we're talking about, weighting things, right? So Alan yesterday said, I've been in this business a long time. People have been talking about balancing things, and I've yet to see a moral scale, right? This is a question of balancing. I don't have a moral scale, and these are the types of things about which reasonable people can disagree. And so I'll just conclude by saying this. If you are among those who say, 8 years of additional slavery is so horrific to those individuals that there's nothing after that which would weigh more than that, I'm not going to call you unreasonable. Thank you, guys. This was fun.
I think it's fairly safe to say that even 153 years removed from the conclusion of the American Civil War, the root of this conversation, the root of the discussion, is still among, if not the most hotly debated things within our country. And arguing the merits of the quotes that you have, you can see another really great benefit to the conversations we have and share in the McCain conference, get to the various lenses that I think we all come to these matters with. And you've certainly given us an opportunity, looking at a very unique lens, to an oft-heard discussion. So for that, we're very deeply grateful. And in that, we'll present you with, to take back to that great Navy town of St. Louis, not just an appropriate ball cap to the conference, but also one that I think is one of the most handsome of ship's caps for the USS Stockdale. So Professor Wellman, thanks again for your thoughts and your time with us today. Thanks. Here we go.